right, we're going to get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. My name is Angela Rashidi, and I am a research fellow here at AEI, a research fellow in poverty studies. I also want to welcome anyone who's tuning in to our live stream online. And just a piece of housekeeping, we are going to be taking questions from our online audience. So those of you out there watching, please feel free to use the, it's Slido, slido.com, and enter code AEI event. It's very simple. Just enter your name and you can enter your question, and then I get it on my iPad and I can ask either the members or our panel later questions. So I'm really excited for our event today. We have, childcare has really become an important issue. Throughout the 2016 presidential campaign, it really became a priority issue, and it hasn't waned too much. There's really been a focus on working families and trying to make childcare more affordable for them. And as many of you in the room know, childcare can be cost prohibitive for many families who are looking to work, ranging from $600 to $2,000 a month, depending on the age of the child and where that family lives. So it's such a pleasure that we are hosting today two members of Congress who have really focused on this issue. We're going to hear from them about a bill that they have proposed. So we have Representative Kevin Yoder of Kansas and Representative Stephanie Murphy of Florida. So welcome. First, we're going to hear from both of them, and we're going to follow that up with a panel of experts to discuss not only the child care tax credit, but just other issues around child care and how to make that more affordable for working families. So without further delay, I want to introduce Representative Kevin Yoder. Representative Yoder is currently serving his fourth term in Congress. He represents the 3rd District in Kansas, which includes Kansas City and the surrounding suburbs. He has a long history of supporting legislation for working families, and he also has a reputation in Congress of bringing civility to government. So it's a pleasure to have you here, Representative Yoder. And then following Representative Yoder, it's Representative Stephanie Murphy, and she will also provide some brief remarks. Representative Murphy has an impressive background. She is a businesswoman, or was a businesswoman, and also a college instructor. She now represents the 7th District in Florida, which includes downtown Orlando. So let's welcome them both. They're going to give brief remarks, followed by a Q&A with me, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. So Representative Yoder.
Well, Angela, thank you for having us here today. We're very excited that you've put on this forum, an opportunity for us to talk about an issue that I think is important to all of us in this room, but it's really important to a lot of families struggling to make ends meet all across this country. And as we've been engaging in the tax reform debate, we have been speaking out and joining other voices to say that working families are who should be focused on the most, and we need to look at the burden specifically they're facing. And really one area that has been under discussed and has not received, I think, the spotlight that it needs to is the struggling costs of childcare that many families are facing. Stephanie and I are actually both working parents. I have 2 little girls, ages 2 and 4, and they are right in the heart of childcare costs. And so I know this issue personally, and I know lots of families in my community that are working to pay their student loans, save 529 accounts for their children's college, and figure out how to keep them in childcare at the same time. There's not a lot of money left over for a lot of these families, and so this is one area where we think we can really make a difference. If you look just generally at the cost of childcare across the country, they've risen 170% over the last 25 years. In my state, in Kansas, the average cost of childcare for an infant is over $11,000 a year. Now, that's more than the average cost of a year of college tuition at a Kansas university. I think my tuition was about $1,000 a semester. So a lot of families are paying almost a semester's worth of college, my era, in 1 month of infant care. So these are drastic costs, and when you look at the cost of many families' mortgages, most families actually, if they have young children, will spend more on childcare than they will even on housing costs. So I think these numbers illustrate how childcare costs make it difficult for parents to find quality care for their kids while they try to work. Nearly 2 out of every 3 families in America have both parents in the workforce. So this puts a lot of families in a tough predicament when they look at the high cost of childcare. In many cases, you have a working mother who has had a child who has to decide whether she would like to go back to work. In many cases, she would like to go, many cases, it's a necessity that she goes back to work to pay for the bills of their family, and yet you have to weigh that against the cost of childcare. In my own family, we do this. In many families, where you say, okay, what's actually childcare cost, and what is your actual take-home pay? And as those numbers get closer, it takes those folks out of the workforce, many times women, but also men who leave the workforce, and that has drastic consequences for our economy. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go forward. But this is an economic issue as well as a family support issue. So as we sort of look at how we move forward on this, there are really two provisions in federal law that help families deal with child care costs. The first is the Child Independent Care Tax Credit, and the second is the flexible savings accounts. These are two tools that families can use to help defray their child care costs. Stephanie and I have introduced the PACE Act. The PACE Act would increase those amounts, would index them for inflation, and would make them refundable so that families who are at the poverty line or who don't make enough money to qualify for a tax credit can use them as well. And it's really a strange aberration of federal law that we would tell families, you make too much money, or you make too little money for us to help you with your child care costs, right? You don't make enough for us to help you with child care costs. It doesn't make any sense. Those families probably need it the most as they struggle with child care costs as much as anyone. And so that legislation we've introduced, we have a lot of bipartisan sponsors, and we've been working through the tax process to try to get that implemented. We've been successful in keeping those provisions in the base law, and we hope ultimately we'll be able to increase them and get them indexed for the future. But I just thank you all for taking the time to be here, and I really want to thank Stephanie. She's been a wonderful bipartisan co-sponsor of the legislation at a time in which we feel that Congress doesn't work together, that members of Congress don't like each other, that we're not trying to solve problems, but we're just fighting. This is an example of the type of legislation that's common sense that both political parties should be able to get behind. So thank you for being here, and turn it back over, Angela.
Great, thanks. And Congresswoman Murphy?
I just would like to echo the gratitude that Kevin expressed to AEI and Angela for putting on this important panel discussion. I think it's really timely given what we are going to be looking at voting on this week. But I'm really excited to be here with Kevin as well to talk about the PACE Act. You know, one of my favorite photos of him is he's on the floor, I think, taking an oath, or right? And he's got one little girl under his arm and the other hand in the air. And it to me just sort of defines what it feels like sometimes to be a working parent. You know, you're trying to go about your day and do your work, and you have kids that you're bringing along for the ride. So I also have two kids. I have a 3-year-old and a 7-year-old, and I have set up a closet in my office for future members, and it's really their office. They call it their office. I may have emphasized the importance of their office, because my daughter immediately after moving into our office comes out into mine and says, "Mommy, I need to see you in my office now." And so she is adapting to this life. I've been a working mom for a while, and so I know how hard it is to juggle the day-to-day responsibilities of being a parent. And I know that families across this country are really struggling to be able to pay for childcare. And childcare as a proportion of all of the household's expenses is increasing. And I think back to my childhood, and my mom and dad were both working class folks, and my mom's entire salary, save I think about $120, went to my childcare. And that $120 was what she'd have to figure out how to buy groceries for the month with. And so it forced them into working second jobs and things like that. And we shouldn't ever be in a situation where if you're working 40 hours a week, you can't afford the things like childcare and groceries, and that you have to make those types of decisions. And you know, over the last 15 years alone, those childcare costs have risen by more than 20%. So that situation that our family had quite some time ago has only gotten worse over time, with childcare making up a bigger part of it. And in my home state of Florida, childcare is especially expensive. Only about 30% of families can afford childcare. And so if you think about the economy and what that does to families' ability to both be in the workforce, it's quite significant. The average cost of infant care in Florida is about $8,700, which is twice as much as it costs to go to a 4-year public university in Florida. And that's just appalling, I think. It's astounding and appalling, which is why, trying to get at this problem, how do you solve for it? How do you make childcare more affordable for American families? We were able to introduce this PACE Act. And the House companion, our bill is a companion to a Senate bill introduced by Senators King and Burr. So I think we have both chambers interested in this issue as well as both parties. And I don't think that this particular issue, this family issue, is necessarily a partisan issue. It's not a Republican issue or a Democratic issue. It's just a human issue. And the way our bill will expand the child dependent care tax credit and enhance the value of the dependent care FSAs and would index both to inflation. I think both of these tax provisions are long overdue for an update to reflect what the reality of today's child care is. That's true.
Okay, sorry.
And I don't think that the PACE Act would be a cure-all necessarily for all the high cost of childcare, but it would certainly be a step in the right direction. And as we were discussing before this event, I think thanks in part to a large coalition of childcare groups, we were able to preserve the Child and Development Care Tax Credit in the recent House tax plan. And I think this was quite a feat because we were already having that conversation. When they look to scrap all sorts of other credits and whatnot, this one was one that I think there was a point in time where it was on the cutting room floor, but we were able to get back in. And so, as we were saying outside, that you can't build on this credit unless it still exists. So I'm glad to see that the House Ways and Means Committee has approved also an amendment to restore the dependent care flex spending accounts. And then over on the Senate side, they also released their tax plan, and it includes the CDCTC and the FSAs. So as you probably all know, we're slated to vote on the House bill probably as soon as tomorrow, right? And while I have concerns, some concerns about the overall tax plan, I'm really glad that we were successful in protecting the key provisions in both chambers for childcare. And I know that we'll probably continue to push for the PACE Act because we want to make sure that the improvements happened in CDCTC and FSAs, and that it remains a part of the conversation as tax reform moves forward. And if not through tax reform, maybe there'll be another vehicle or another legislative vehicle or another option for this. And I just think that whether you're a parent who's caring for a child or a disabled parent, because it goes for both, you shouldn't have to choose between your job and taking care of your loved ones. And this country always says that we are for family values, and but I think if you're going to be for family values, you have to start valuing families, and you do so by helping them with this critical issue. And then I just want to end with a quote that Bloomberg put out in an editorial about the PACE Act. They called it a small but meaningful step that Congress can take to measurably improve the lives of millions of American families. And I think in a Congress that sometimes feels so gridlocked, I think small and meaningful is what we should be shooting for in a whole host of areas when it comes to improving the lives of American families. So thank you again for having me, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Great. Well, thank you both for your excellent remarks. And we have time for a couple questions from me, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. But I'm just struck by one thing you said, Representative Yoder, and so I'll ask kind of both of you this. But there's been really a lot of attention or focus put on middle class or working class families and how government can maybe help them out. Can you just talk, maybe Representative Yoder first, just talk a little bit about how you think this bill sort of fits into kind of a broader working families agenda, but then also just how it fits into a broader effort to get, the economy kind of moving a little bit stronger again.
Yeah, when you look at regular working class families, there are very clear, specific barriers to being successful. And we've identified childcare as one of those key barriers. as we've discussed, the cost of it, and the choices it makes families make. And specifically when you look at an agenda in Congress where we're all working hard to grow the economy. And we believe that in a growing economy is a rising tide that's going to solve a lot of problems. The best deficit reduction comes from a growing economy. The best investment in our infrastructure and in education and in medical research comes from a growing economy, which creates more resources for the government. But a growing economy means we're going to have more workers. And when you have such a significantly low unemployment rate right now, which is a remarkable achievement and shows where we are economically, we also have a low labor force participation rate. We're going to have to get a greater participation rate to fill the jobs that we want to create to grow the economy. A 4% economic growth means 10 million new jobs. And as immigration legislation continues to be stalled, who's going to do these jobs? What workers will step forward that aren't working now to do those? And so there are currently 3.5 million families with kids in America with no parent currently employed. And so for at least some of these families, a major barrier to finding and holding a job is the cost of childcare for their kids. They can't afford to work. And we often hear rhetoric in Congress about, people that are on government resources, people that are on subsistence from the government and aren't getting out to work. Well, let's give them the tools that they need so that they can actually go out and work and be productive and not be relying on the government. So it has all sorts of ancillary benefits. This is a middle class necessity, but it's also an economic growth necessity as well.
Great. And Representative Murphy, you touched on quality a little bit. Can you talk a little, and you also, mentioned how this is one small but meaningful step forward. Can you talk a little bit about how you do see this bill kind of fitting into a broader agenda to increase quality childcare for kids?
Well, so I remember when I first sought to find childcare for my kids, I think, I had interviewed and hired tons of people. I've had all the skill sets in the business world, but when it came to looking for somebody who was going to take care of probably one of the most important people in my life, it was really hard to know what questions to ask, what to look for. How do you even begin to make that choice? And so I know that for so many families, this is one of the most important choices that they make, who's going to take care of their children when they're not around. And so it's a deeply personal decision. And we've seen so much research that talks about that quality childcare in those developmental years that we're talking about has such a significant impact on the success of the child as they grow. And so I think that being able to help people afford childcare will allow that that industry, that service, to continue to get better, to grow, provide the quality care that we're all looking for. I think it's important that we hear from families about not only child care, but the other kind of care. So the Child Independent Care Tax Credit also applies to your elderly parents. And I think that's another place where it's a deeply personal decision to identify the person who's going to take care of maybe a disabled or an elderly parent. So how do you ensure that not only can you afford that, but that the care that they're receiving is of the quality that you would want to leave somebody you love deeply with, with?
Great. We're running a little short on time, but I have to ask this question. I'm a research fellow in poverty studies, and so I focus on low-income populations. And you had mentioned that the child care tax credit has remained in the tax reform as it is now, but it's not going to be made refundable, at least right now. Can you just talk a little bit about what can be done for low-income families and maybe what needs to sort of happen in the future if it's not going to happen, maybe right now?
Well, I think as a point as I made earlier, the idea that you make too much money to have support for childcare is counterintuitive. And I've made the case to my colleagues in the House that if they see the merit of keeping the credit, then they should make sure it helps the people who need it the most. Right? And so if it's good for middle-class families, it should be good for all families. We're certainly very pleased that it's staying in there because this is an excellent tool that many middle-class families use, but we want to expand it so that folks on the lower middle-class spectrum, folks at the poverty line, have access to childcare, because that goes back to the economic growth issue as well as just the fairness issue. I've been an advocate for additional funding for early Head Start education as well, which I know Stephanie supports very strongly as well, because there are many families that just don't have access to early child care options. And maybe some of the child care options they have access to aren't high quality. And we want every child to have the same opportunities in this country, right? This is part of our debate, is that no matter where you're from, no matter who you are, everyone has an opportunity to succeed. But if you start kindergarten and you can't read, and you've fallen behind because no one read your books, you never went to any sort of preschool readiness program, in many cases, unless the schools are really diligent, those children get lost in the system, and by fourth grade, you can start extrapolating how their life results may differ, from college degrees to welfare programs to imprisonment. All that can be, I think, significantly decreased by a focus particularly on early childhood education for people at or near the poverty level.
Any comments about low-income families?
Well, I agree with what Kevin's saying, and I think, it's like he said, it's about giving them the tools to make decisions that enable them to care for their family, engage and productively contribute to the economy. And so I would love to see us modernize these programs. I mean, I think we've won one small battle, which is to get people to acknowledge that it's important, and so it still exists. But I think the next battle is to help people understand that it needs to be modernized to reflect the American family of today and also the cost of childcare.
Great. I have a great question from somebody online, and then I'm going to turn it to the in-person audience. So the question from online is about how many parents are concerned about government involvement in childcare. And so they're wondering how this bill is different and how it gets government out of the business of providing childcare directly, I think is what they're alluding to.
Well, I mean, this isn't an example of where the government is providing the child care. It's really providing options. I have heard some folks make the case that this incentivizes working mothers to leave home and that it works in a perverse way. And I just think that is such a 1950s way of looking at how people actually decide whether they want to go to work. Many mothers would love to stay home. Many fathers would love to stay home. But the expenses of all the mortgage and college and childcare, it makes it really a necessity that many families have to be a two-family income. That's the necessity of the current economy. And so really what we're doing here is helping avoid government reliance, helping avoid people having to receive government benefits because they're not working, because the childcare costs are too expensive for them at a minimum wage job or to enter the workforce. They'll look at the childcare costs and say, why would I go to work when I have these social programs and childcare costs are a prohibitor? Let's get rid of that. That prohibits them from getting into the workforce, and hopefully that encourages them, allow the single parent to go work. And if you're in a two-family home and the mother or father chooses not to work, awesome. What a great opportunity for them. But many families don't feel like they have that luxury because of the cost of the economy.
Right. Any questions from the audience? Just raise your hand. We'll bring a mic. Any questions? Belle?
I'm Isabel Sawhill from Brookings, and I want to commend both of you for your legislation. I've long been in favor of a refundable child care tax credit, as have many others. In fact, when I was in OMB, I one time tried to make it refundable and tried to cap it at the top. I mean, not, maybe at $150,000 a year. It's because it is really not targeted to those who need it most right now, as well as not being, I think, sufficiently generous. But I think what I wanted to ask is kind of a follow-on to what Angela was saying, which is this larger landscape of, we have a block grant program on the spending side of the budget. We have the child care and dependent care tax credit, and then we have the child tax credit, which is being expanded, and which there seems to be a lot of support for, although it's very unclear to some of us, especially to me, the extent to which the child tax credit, not the child care one, will be refundable. I've read that it will be refundable against payroll taxes, but if you're a working parent with children, you're already going to get the EITC if you're below a certain income level and have enough payroll taxes. So I'm not sure the child tax credit is going to help anybody at the bottom either. Can either of you clarify whether any of these proposals, either on the spending side or on the tax side, is going to help anybody who's poor? This is Angela's question again. It just seems so perverse to provide all these new tax credits, especially the child tax credit, which is now going to be very generous, but not have it help people at the bottom.
I don't.
Sorry if that's
No, it's
overly wonky question.
It's a good question, and I don't know specifically the answer on the overlap of the earned income tax credit. It's a very interesting wrinkle you've laid out. I assume that same thing would lay out with the PACE Act under the same situation. If you've already received the EITC and under PACE, we make it refundable. There may be, I don't know how that works if you've already received a refund on all of your payroll taxes. So a good question. There are a number of things I think that focus on working families at the poverty line. I do think the refundability, other than the question you've raised, is an important factor. The standard deduction being raised to $24,000 for a married couple. Ideally, that's a zero tax bracket for anyone under $24,000. I think that is targeted at folks at the lower income spectrum. But in many cases, unless you're doing refundability on the payroll tax, many of these families just don't pay a lot of income taxes, right? Because their income is so low that they end up having it sort of exempt. And so I think we raise that a little bit more so that there's greater families that just owe no income taxes. But you're right. This is why we make PACE refundable. Ultimately, that's the key. And the earned income tax credit is maintained in that legislation. Again, that was something that has been debated about. Why are we giving people money back they didn't actually, earn? I've heard those arguments, but this was a kind of Ronald Reagan era. How do you get people into the workforce? The same kind of thing we're talking about here is to reward work. And you're going to have to decide what you want to incentivize in federal policy. Do you want to incentivize reliance, or do you want to incentivize productivity? All of it's being sensitive to the needs people are facing, but the question is, which side are you addressing that on? I think that's why the refundability appeals to me, at least, and others, is to say, if you're out working, you're out creating an income, even if it doesn't qualify for income taxes, we're going to help you return some of those payroll, because everybody pays payroll taxes, no matter what they make.
And people don't realize that.
That's right. And that's a big chunk when you look at that for bringing much in. So, bless you.
Thank you.
So unfortunately, we have to cut the members' time a little bit short because they do need to get back for a vote. But I would like to thank both of them very much again for coming and talking to us about your bill and just about broader issues of childcare. And if everybody would just stay seated while the members leave. And again, let's...
Unless they want to do a standing ovation.
Unless they
we can do that too.
Right. But let's thank them again.
All right,
Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you so
But I had to cut my introductory remarks a little bit short because I knew we had to cut the members' time a little bit short. And I didn't get a chance to mention, just what an all-star panel we really do have. For anybody who's familiar with the issue of child care assistance in the tax code and just, more broadly, you definitely are going to recognize, the names of the people that we have here. So it's really a pleasure to have all of you here, and I'm really looking forward to a very robust conversation. So I am going to do some brief introductions, and then we're going to actually just jump right into questions. And just again, a reminder for our online audience, because we did have some questions I wasn't able to get to, but we're taking questions for the panel as well. So please go to slido.com and enter in your question. So I'm going to go from my right down to the end of the end of the stage. To my direct right, it's really a pleasure to have Alan with us. So this is Alan Viard. He's a resident scholar at AEI and specializes in federal tax and budget policy. Among his many credentials, he spent time as a senior economist at the Dallas Fed and for the White House's Council of Economic Advisors. He's written a number of times about childcare in the tax system. Most recently, he had a great article in The Hill that I hope all of you have either read, and if not, you should go find it because it was a really great article. So it's really a pleasure to have Alan here. And then I'm going to go all the way down to the end. This is Elaine Mogg. Elaine holds a degree in public policy, and she's a senior research scientist at the Urban Institute's Tax Policy Center. And again, anybody who's paid any attention to the issue of childcare will definitely recognize her name. She's done a lot of empirical work looking at child care tax credit, child tax credit, costing it out. She's always one of the experts, at least I go to read her work when I'm interested in this issue. So it's also a pleasure to have you here. We also have two early learning experts with us. So I kind of think of Alan and Elaine as our tax experts. And then we also have early learning experts. So we have Sarah Rittling here next to Elaine, and she's the national director for the First 5 Years Fund, which is an organization that is dedicated to early childhood education and development. She has worked in a number of educated-related positions, including working on Capitol Hill prior to her current position at First 5 Years Fund. So she has a very, broad scope in terms of her view of this issue. And then finally, right in the middle, Catherine Stevens. And Catherine leads AEI's Early Childhood Program, where she researches and comments on early childhood education and the implications, particularly for low-income children. She has almost 2 decades, I believe, of experience in this space and holds a PhD in education policy from Columbia University. So welcome, all of you, and let's jump right in. So, Alan, I'd like to start with you and just ask for your thoughts and kind of your rationale for using the tax code to cover work expenses such as child care, as well as the child care tax credit in particular.
Sure. Yeah, this is the perspective that I bring to this issue, which I think is one of many valid perspectives that you can approach the issue from. But I look at this from the perspective of tax policy, and economists have studied the issues and developed a number of principles that should guide tax policy. And one of them is that there should be tax relief for the cost of earning income. At some level, the intuition is really pretty simple, that if the tax code is going to tax you on the wages that you earn, for example, then you should be allowed tax relief for the costs that you had to incur in order to earn those wages. It's similar to the principle that businesses, if they're taxed on the revenue that they bring in, should also receive tax relief for the expenses that they incurred in earning that revenue. Well, child care has always been, I guess, a key point in my mind on this front, simply because the statistical evidence is so clear-cut, not to mention just common sense intuition as well. The economic definition of a work-related cost is pretty clear-cut. It's a cost that if you reduce it, it encourages people to work more. And there's a number of expenditures that may have some relationship to work and that you might think would fall into this category, and a number of them probably do. But in many cases, it's very hard to know for sure, statistically, if they have that property or not. In the case of childcare, we do know. So the question, just to be clear, is whether making childcare cheaper increases work. In particular, does it prompt parents to enter the labor force who otherwise would not have done so? I think common sense probably tells us that that's the case, but you don't have to rely on common sense. A host of statistical studies have been done examining the relationship between childcare costs and parental labor force participation. And the evidence is just absolutely overwhelming that there is a strong, clear-cut connection there. And so if anything is going to qualify as a cost of earning wages, childcare definitely does, and therefore we need to provide tax relief for childcare costs. Just to mention one misconception before I close this answer is some people say, well, shouldn't the tax code be neutral? Shouldn't it, isn't it wrong for the tax code to promote certain types of expenditures like childcare in preference to other types of expenditures that don't get a tax break? In general, that's right, but that logic does not apply in the way that people think it does when it's a work-related cost. The point to realize is that when the tax system taxes the wages earned by working, it inherently discourages and reduces expenditure on work-related costs. And that providing tax relief for those costs is needed to bring the playing field back to level. So it's not a case of artificially preferring these work-related expenses, but instead of just offsetting the bias that the tax system would otherwise have against them.
Just a real quick follow-up question. So, we heard from Representative Yoder about, economic growth, and, do you have concerns that we might not have enough workers in the future for the jobs, enough workers for the jobs that we have, and do you think that childcare might, have a role in that?
I think it's clearly true. I mean, we know that for demographic reasons that the labor force is growing more slowly and will continue to grow more slowly than it did in the past. We obviously can't really change the demographics, but what we can do is think about ways to increase labor force participation among the people who are in the relevant age groups. And first and foremost, I think, should be looking at where does the tax system impose barriers to labor force participation, and how can we ease those barriers. And I think one just obvious way to do that is to make sure that we provide adequate tax relief for child care costs. And I think for reasons that have been discussed earlier, the current child care tax credit does part of what's needed on that front, but falls short. And so we need to really look at expanding it.
And so, Elaine, I'm going to ask you this question. We heard from a question from the audience, from Belle, about the child tax credit. Can you just tell us, and we just heard from Alan about the kind of, work expense and how child care tax credit addresses that. Can you talk to us a little bit about the difference between the child tax credit, the child care tax credit, and then kind of get into this issue that Alan's talking about in terms of work expenses? Do they both do the same thing, or do they kind of both serve a different purpose?
So first, thank you for letting me come today. It's very exciting. And also, I noticed that the tax people are very, on the opposite ends of the stage. And the education people get to sit together, but we promise not to have any fist fights today. You point out a good thing, that there's sort of two credits that are very similar, the child tax credit and the child care credit, but they actually do very different things. So the child tax credit is a $1,000 credit for families with children under 17. The credit, and this is where it really differs from the child care credit, is it's mostly refundable. So that means even if you don't owe federal income taxes, you can receive your child tax credit as a refund at the end of the year. As a result, that means the child tax credit affects a much broader population than the child care credit. So the child tax credit goes to almost 75% of families with children. The people who are left out are very, very low income families, or high-income families who don't qualify for the credit, and then families with children who are 17 or over. In contrast, the child care credit goes to just 12% of families, so it's a very narrow credit, and I would suggest that many more than 12% of families have child care expenses, but they're not necessarily able to access the child care credit because it's not refundable. The CTC is a little bit easier for people because you don't have to document specific expenses, and allows families to make choices about how they're going to spend their money. Whereas the child care credit requires that you have out-of-pocket expenses. And here's where I like to point out that low-income families often have great child care needs, but they often fill those needs by working alternate schedules with a partner, going to informal care, things that don't qualify for the child care credit, but might actually be the most expensive care out there. And what I mean by that is it becomes unreliable. So when my child is sick, my sister may not be willing to take my child for the day, and now I have to miss a day of work. But that, I can't get that day of work back from the child care credit. And the last thing is that as a result of this refundability, the distribution of who's being helped is quite different. So when Representative Yoder talks about how he wants to help working families, and we talk about this being, the child care credit being small and meaningful, what I would say is it's not meaningful for low-income families. Almost no benefits go to families in the lowest fifth of the distribution. They're sort of shoved up, and I think roughly 20% of benefits go to families in the very highest income distribution. And that's different from the child care credit, where it's sort of flipped, where benefits are sort of spread evenly from the first through fourth income quintiles, and then the highest group is left out. So it doesn't, the child tax credit doesn't necessarily, directly offset child care credits because it can do so much more, but there's no reason families can't use their child tax credit to help subsidize expenses. The real barrier, though, with both of these credits in the child care context is that we get tax credits when we file our tax returns, and the IRS sends our refund back. That's in February, March, April of the year after we need to pay our child care bill. So there's always going to be a limit with how much the child tax credit or the child care credit can do to really subsidize expenses for low-income families.
Great, I'm glad you raised that point, and we'll come back to that point, I think, a little later. Just a real quick follow-up. There's been a little bit of, I guess, debate, or even, and maybe it's just how the media covers it, but almost two camps. One supports an expansion to the child tax credit. One supports, an expansion to the child care tax credit, and it's almost presented as if they can't both happen at the same time. Can you just speak a little bit? I mean, can they both not happen at the same time? Do they serve, the same purpose, or should they kind of be complements of each other?
So absent revenue limitations, there's no reason you can't have both. You can't expand both. I think the ideas in the legislation in the PACE Act make a lot of sense, where, allowing expenses to keep pace with inflation, expanding them more broadly. It's probably a good policy. It's still very poorly targeted, though. It's still always going to go to families that are quite high income. So, I think at the beginning of this year, there was a lot of conversation about expanding just the child care benefits. And I know my writing on this topic was critical of this approach, because I think we were putting what I consider to be limited dollars into exactly the wrong pockets with these big child care deductions that were being talked about. And at the time, I definitely was of the opinion, if we have a small amount of money, we ought to try to target it on those families who are most constrained by child care costs. And my suggestion is that those are low-income families with the child tax credit is much better at touching.
Right. And I guess to Alan's point, the child care tax credit sort of directly offsets those work expenses in a way the child tax credit wouldn't necessarily, right? Is that right?
Well, in that you have to have them to get any
Right.
child care credit, but
Right.
child tax credit can be used, and I'm sure it is used to help pay for child care. Also, Alan did mention this research about how effective subsidies for child care are at getting people to work, but I don't think the research is clean at all that the child care credit has had an effect. I think the research is more in the spending programs that are providing sort of direct subsidies to families when they need them, when they incur their child care expenses.
Great. Okay, so now I want to bring in our early learning experts. So Sarah, maybe I'll start with you. So when it comes to legislation, really any legislation, that focuses on childcare, what, from your perspective, should be the goals? And do you think the child care tax credit sort of can address those goals?
Sure, thank you, and thank you for having me, and I actually really want to thank you for calling me an expert. I'm going to be using that now, wherever I go. I think when we at the First 5 Years Fund are really focused on how we can increase access to quality. You heard Congresswoman Murphy talk about the importance of quality. We had a question about that on the Congressional panel. And in thinking about how we do that at the federal level in particular, we have to be paying attention to what is on the congressional calendar. Congress does not move at the speed of light, and they don't tend to multitask. So, for example, last year, within the education world, there was a lot of time and attention being spent on reauthorization of our K-12 law. And so what opportunities were there within that law to try to get the federal government and the federal policy to keep pace with what's happening at the state and local level on early learning, which is actually a lot. And so that's an example of a time where we kind of stepped in and saw an opportunity there. I think that's the case now with what's happening in tax reform, and particularly on this tax credit. This is what is being considered before Congress. This is something that every special interest group, every corporation, every household is talking about, and has hired people all over town to help them influence the process. And as an early childhood advocate, I don't see a reason why we would do any differently in trying to get what we think we can get out of that bill for kids and families, and particularly low-income families, which is really what we're trying to do on that. And it's a luxury, I think, these days to have a bipartisan effort, one led by a Republican and a Democrat on both sides of the Capitol, leading complementary efforts. And so I think it's an opportunity that we have to be taking advantage of. It's not going to be perfect. It's not going to solve our problems and the needs of families, but particularly the needs of children who are living in poverty, birth through age 5. But we have to be doing what we can in that.
Great. So Catherine, and I'm going to move my chair forward a little bit because I'm straining my neck to try to make eye contact with my panelists. So Catherine, so you've been a little bit more critical of, the PACE Act directly, but also kind of using the Childcare and dependent tax credit. Can you just talk a little bit about some of your concerns, and then even broader, same question that I asked of Sarah, sort of what are your goals, and how does maybe this vehicle fall short?
So what I find disappointing about sitting in this chair right this minute is my goals are the same as the goals that were just articulated by the representatives. And they did such an outstanding and inspirational job of describing the problem and the importance of the problem, which is why it's so peculiar to me that they're promoting a solution that will do essentially nothing to address the problem that they have really eloquently described. And I would say the person that I am most agreement with on our stage here is Alan. And the reason for that is if Alan were in charge of promoting the PACE Act, no one would have heard a word from me. Alan believes that it makes sense to have a rational tax code that, in fact, gives people tax breaks for producing income. Okay, this is his expertise, that makes sense to me. But that's not how this has been promoted. How this has been promoted is expanding access to high-quality childcare for the families that need it the most. And that is I would say, a radical misstatement of what this will do. I just have a very few slides to explain why I'm saying that. So the thing to know is, Nicole, can you help? Or no, sorry. How do I go full screen? Oh, like that? Sorry. Okay, so this is what we need to remember. What we need to remember is, what we need to keep in mind, the devil is in the details, as is always the case in policy. So the families earn the lowest income when their children are the youngest, because they are at the beginning of their careers. So almost 1/2 of children, 48% of children birth through age 5, live in families with income below 200% of the poverty level. So for a family of 4, these numbers are for a family of 4, the poverty level is $24,600, and 200% is $49,200 a year annual income. So these are the families that we are talking about. Those are arguably the low-income families, and those are not a small number of families in this country. What we also know, and I don't need to repeat this to you, and both the Congress people were very articulate on this, these are the most crucial years of human development, and that's clear. There's not a lot of disagreement on that at this point. So for a family earning $49,200 a year, which is the upper limit of this 48% low-income group, those people will get $75 extra per month from PACE. According to Kevin Yoder's office, the child care cost for an infant and a preschooler, a family of 4 earning $49,200, high-quality child, decent child care for those children will cost $1,600 a month, and PACE is giving them an extra $75. That's just actually how this is designed. So that leaves them with a monthly cost that they have to cover of $1,525. So to get to Elaine's point of the problem, one problem with this kind of thing can be that you do not get the money monthly. But let's just say you got it monthly. You get $75 monthly. You're left with $1,500. So let's just look at the household finances of that family of 4 earning $49,200. Monthly take home, which could be reduced if they eliminate all our taxes. Right now, monthly take home for that family is $3,370. Let's say they have a 2-bedroom apartment, $850. These numbers are from kind of Common Estimates, Economic Policy Institute. $780 for food, $620 for transportation, $680 for health care. These numbers could be bigger, these numbers could be smaller. That leaves them with a balance of $440 for everything else. So Kevin Yoder talked about this. He talked about, both representatives talked about how family finances and how people are struggling to choose between groceries and childcare. But in this case, they've got $440. Now this is the top of that one half of kids under age 6. Clothing, diapers, appliances, dishes, towels, cell phones, internet, vacations, holiday gifts, college savings, retirement, and they've not even gotten to their $1,525 that they have to pay to get to childcare after their PACE benefit. So this is the family that is at the top end of that other essential quartile. It's about 23% of children are in families living below the poverty line. They get more from PACE. And that is preferable from one point of view. However, the child care cost for them is the same as it is for any other family, $1,600 a month. So the cost that they have to cover is $1,375 a month. So now let's look at their household finances, which is not at all a fun thing to do. A family of 4 earning $24,600, 2 working parents, again, an infant and a preschooler. Their monthly take home is about $1,800 a month. And this same exact expenses, that gives them a monthly balance of minus $1,100, which they have to, so with a minus $1,140, they haven't even bought diapers or a new winter coat, much less $1,300 in their monthly child care cost. So here's the bottom line. Millions of families have insufficient disposable income to either pay for or to save for child care. So the other piece of the PACE Act are what are called flexible savings accounts. Those enable families to put pre-tax, families who work for employers who offer those, which is a small percentage of families, but let's just say they did, right? Let's say you're working at McDonald's and McDonald's is offering this to you. You are allowed to put pre-tax dollars into that account. But that family already has minus $1,100. The family before that had $440. It's not clear where that money is going to come from. And in fact, this is why almost half of Americans report they don't have enough money to cover a $400 emergency. The average household in the lower third income bracket ended up $2,300 in the red at the end of 2015, and 4 out of 10 American households have $0 in savings. So this is just the reality. This is the reality of these families. So I actually have absolutely no problem with what Alan says. I just don't. What I do have a problem with is describing this bill or this proposal as something that will help low-income working families, because it just simply can't. So This is, in fact, the current CDCTC, which is the child care tax credit, combined with the flexible savings accounts. This is the distribution of the families, the distribution of the benefit annually. So those 3 bars in red are families earning under $50,000 a year. So you'll notice 2 things about those bars. One is they're very short bars because those are small numbers of families that are benefiting. And 2, you'll notice that those bars are well under an annual benefit of $700 a year, when Representative Yoder and Murphy were both very eloquent on the drastic expenses of childcare and the critical importance of children, all children, being in high quality care so that they get a fair start. So when you take what they articulated in an inspirational way, an inspirational bipartisan way, and you look at this chart, you realize these pieces are not fitting together. This is the last slide I'll show. So there was, in 2016, $5.27 billion spent on what the PACE Act is addressing. And what you'll see there is that gray slice at the bottom is the percentage of that total that was spent on those families. So, to some extent, the support for this coming from the early childhood community is they're making a political argument, not a substantive argument. What they're saying is, anybody in early childhood knows exactly what I'm explaining to you right here. But what they say is, something is better than nothing. Except for this isn't something. This is not something for millions of families who are exactly the ones who need it. And worse, it gives the impression that we're doing something on something that we are really having, as we saw up here today, growing bipartisan agreement. And that's, the house is burning down, and we're providing people with low-cost plastic spray bottles. That makes us feel good about what we're doing and does absolutely nothing for them. Thank you.
I have to take off my moderator hat for just a moment. Just to be clear, though, on the low-income families, they do receive a number of benefits that those higher-income families would not receive, such as food assistance, health insurance, and the earned income tax credit, which would contribute to their budget.
But not the 48,000 one.
Not the 48,000, right, but the 24,000.
Yeah, absolutely. Those numbers, to be clear and to reinforce your point, those are rough numbers. I mean, there's details around the numbers this way and that way. That's just sort of giving. I wanted to provide a kind of a rough idea.
No, thank you. So Catherine makes some very good points. I'm not going to say I 100% agree with Catherine, but I think she's raising some really good points. And so I want to ask you, Alan, is what's in the PACE Act, or even kind of what has been discussed in terms of dollar amount, is it enough to really sort of to realize some of the benefits that you're talking about?
Well, I think Catherine made an important distinction as to what the objective here really is. And again, my objective here is that you ought to provide appropriate tax relief for the cost of earning income. I think the PACE Act probably is in the ballpark of that. I don't know if the goal is really to equalize the income distribution or meet all the needs of lower income households. I think that's certainly more than any single tax policy, or certainly the child care tax credit can do. I would, want to maybe push back a little bit on some of your statements. Today the child care credit is non-refundable, right? Under the PACE Act, it goes to a 50% fully refundable credit, up to the dollar caps. That surely is doing something for low-income people. You can't say it's absolutely nothing.
But once it's fully refundable, it's only refundable for child care expenditures you've made.
Sure.
So if you have negative $1,000 before you've bought diapers, if there's a good shot, you're not.
They can use their earned income tax credit that they got the year before.
We can add that in. We could all put our heads together and.
Well, I do want to get back to the
this.
advanceability comment that Elaine said. But Alan, to finish your thought.
I just think that's the key point. It's an interesting approach that the PACE Act has taken. I think they they keep the dollar limits that apply today, although they index them to inflation going forward. The dollar limits are very low, $3,000 of cost for one child, $6,000 for two or more, but then they really increase the percentage credit, significantly, that it would be 50% of your cost now up to those limits for low-income people, and then ramping down to 35% at the top rather than ramping down to 20. One could have done this different ways because I think there's actually a pretty strong case for also raising those dollar limits. Again, I think it is critical that the credit would be fully refundable under the PACE Act, while it's fully non-refundable under today's law.
Right. And I guess what they're at least now talking about keeping in the tax reform bill. Elaine, I guess kind of the same question to you. What are your thoughts about just in terms of the dollar amount? Do you think, what's been discussed, and even on, some of the discussions about increasing the child tax credit that you so eloquently distinguished, are we talking about dollar amounts that really could make a difference for families, or not so much?
So I think the research is good and getting even better, that even some relatively small infusions of cash, $1,000, $2,000, coming at a child's early life can have meaningful impacts as the child grows. So it's sort of invest early and pay dividends later. So, and I think that ACT is, going in the right direction. It's making it refundable. I think that's a good idea. I think Alan's point is great when you're increasing the rate. Most people today get that 20% rate. Those high rates, the 35% in the credit today, no one even gets that because they don't owe taxes at that rate. So at least you're, giving some people some access. Now, we estimate at Tax Policy Center, you sort of move the needle from 6% of these lowest income families getting benefits to 7%. So, I'm not saying a lot of people are going to be helped, but there are at least a few people who are going to benefit from this. And I think it's fair to say that, all of this income is needed. Families, want the income, they can use it, and maybe it's not enough and maybe it's not perfect, but it's certainly directionally, in the right way is what I would say.
Why is it that so few of the low-income households do benefit? They don't have the child care
So even
costs?
when you make it refundable, they just don't have the expenses.
Okay.
And I don't think the research is good enough to suggest anyone's going to go out and purchase much more child care or higher quality child care with a child care credit that comes well after the child care bill is due.
Yeah, can I just add to that point? I mean, we can, I'm happy to send my slides to anybody, and I think this is pretty straightforward. You can only spend money on childcare that you have to spend. You only get a refund on money you've spent. And so you get something for spending something. And in what I'm talking about here, and I think we could all go out a couple mile or so from here and talk to plenty of people who can explain how they do not have one penny to spend and therefore do not have the opportunity to get anything back. And I think we are, to be honest, lying to ourselves by pretending otherwise. So I don't hear Alan lying. I hear Alan being very clear about what he's trying to do and how he's doing it and how it makes sense. And I think that is a reasonable way to approach policy that I wish we would be applying to something that we all are recognizing is of such enormous importance.
So Sarah, I know you and I a while ago had this conversation. I'm going to kind of follow through on this, issue of you get a tax credit one time per year, right? So, and it's actually many months after the fact of when you probably incur childcare expenses. So there's been discussions about trying to make it advanceable and actually providing the credit in a monthly way to these families. Can you talk a little bit about that? Do you think that would solve maybe this problem? Do you think that's just not politically feasible? Kind of give us your thoughts about that.
Sure. And I'm going to dodge it slightly to say that I don't think any of what we're saying is going to get to the solutions that the families that Catherine is talking about, like in terms of this tax. Advanceability is not going to do that. It's certainly politically difficult. We're seeing how difficult it is politically even to get what we're all up here talking about and finding the money to be able to do that. So I think, obviously it would help. Whether it's doable at this point, it doesn't feel like it is, but it's not going to even get to what Catherine's saying. And I think you're right, but that's not the current state of affairs. And so I think that's why we, particularly me, First 5 Years Fund and other advocates have to continue, and Catherine in her writing, continue to push for other things at the federal level that help families, specific to access to high quality early childhood. So early Head Start, the childcare subsidy, things like that, preschool development grants, things like that have to be part of a package of issues that we're addressing. And so to answer your question, yeah, could it? Yes. It's not going to get us, though, I don't think, across the finish line in terms of what these families need. And it's going to take a lot of other efforts. But back to my original point, I think, is like, this is where we are, and we all know what we could be doing to make it better, and messaging to Catherine's point, but we have to play the game that's being played. Otherwise, we are as the Congressional panel pointed out, I mean, this credit was going away. So having an argument about whether or not it's getting expanded or made refundable or reaching families, I mean, it was going to go away, and that's money that's going somewhere else. And whether it's helping enough families, it's helping some families, and it was going to go away. And so I think if we really want to make a difference, we have to continue to fight this fight, and it leads to the next fight and the next fight and the next fight. And you have some passionate members now who got their feet wet maybe in tax reform, and maybe one day they'll be fighting for the subsidies.
Can you just talk a little bit more about the subsidies, just for people who maybe aren't quite as familiar? So there is another program out there for child care assistance that does target low-income families.
Yes, it's through the Childcare and Development Block Grant, and it provides subsidies to families to help them, vouchers, not vouchers, but vouchers, to good Republican, to go help them afford childcare.
And the problem, though?
It is woefully underfunded.
Right. I think it's 12% maybe of eligible. Although I did just see a new report came out, and it was much higher among young children who are under 100% of poverty. It was like 50 or 60%. But anyway, I mean, to the point, I guess, so are all of these things, I guess my biggest question, we do have all of these things, which generally, if you're thinking about government programs, you would think more is just inefficient, right? Like, why do you have all these different programs that are sort of addressing the same issue? But then you start, really listening to what all of you are saying, and maybe they don't address the same issue. So are all of these programs sort of complements of each other, or should our lawmakers be focusing on one and do one properly?
So I think we don't do a good job of thinking about our tax and transfer system together, and we do create these inefficiencies, but I can imagine a world where very low income families and moderate income families receive the support they need through the child care grants, and then you come in with the tax system to pick up sort of your middle and high income families. It's efficient for families who aren't cash constrained. They don't have to go to an additional office to apply for benefits. It meets sort of, Allen's test of offsetting these work expenses. So I can imagine we could do a much better job. Now, and when we're in a constrained budget conversation, though, I think we have to ask questions about, where are we going to put our dollars, and where is it politically feasible? I think those are fair things to ask.
I think it would make sense to try to coordinate the flexible spending accounts and the child care tax credit better, so that the tax benefits you receive were really parallel regardless of whether you had the FSA or not. I do agree with Elaine. I think the spending programs serve a separate group of people, and so I think you would not want to try to consolidate those into the tax provisions.
And I would actually eliminate the flexible spending account.
Well, that would actually be one simple way to coordinate them, yes.
Yeah.
Can I
Not a bad
make
idea.
a comment on this, Angela? I mean, I think ultimately we have to recognize that states have to play a much bigger role in this, take a much more responsibility. In the United States, education is the responsibility of the states. We currently spend $650 billion public dollars on public education, and we provide in this country an average public subsidy of $12,500 to the overwhelming, almost all children from kindergarten or first grade through high school. And now, what we're recognizing, which is really wonderful, is that, in fact, the years before kindergarten are the most important developmental years. Those are the years that are laying the educational foundation. If children arrive in kindergarten not ready to learn, there's strong evidence that a great number of them never catch up. So what we might want to think about doing is, if we're committed to a $12,000 $500 subsidy for some years, maybe it makes more sense to be directing that money to early years and paying for high school with tax credits, letting the private sector come in and start apprenticeship programs to fill in the gap. So we in this society, we understand perfectly well that families, many families cannot afford the necessary adequate education for their children. If we were not providing families within some states, as you guys know, $20,000, $30,000 in public subsidy every single year, their kids wouldn't go to school. They can't afford private school. So this is how we have to think about it. We have to recognize that for low-income families, this is, for many of them, this is the foundation of education. And we need to be putting it in that framework. And in most states, if you look at human development of our future generations from birth to 18, in most states, 98% of human development dollars are going to K-12. That doesn't make sense. On the federal level, our Pell Grants are enabling lower income families to, our public subsidies for them to afford college. So when we need to be taking early childhood out primarily of our beyond the offsetting work expenses issue. When we're thinking of it as an education program, which is a different question, we need to be thinking about it the way we think about K-12 and higher ed. And if there's a limited pool of money, which there is, it makes a lot of sense to think about spending that in a more strategic manner, meaning targeting it to the years that are the foundational years for everything that follows.
So one question is, and Catherine, you and I have had this discussion many times, and you and Alan are kind of alluding to this, but I come from a perspective that I primarily focus on ways to increase work among low-income families, and you come from a world, and Sarah as well, about quality, child development and all that. We've often talked about the need to marry these two worlds, and we need to sort of come together when we talk about childcare. But I'm almost thinking, listening to this to all of you talk today, that maybe we shouldn't be marrying them. I guess, Alan, and I saw you nodding sort of when Catherine was talking, so do you think maybe they shouldn't be together?
Well, I think they are separate purposes, and so of course the same policy can serve more than one purpose in many cases. But I do wonder, I think the tax provision arguably should really be dedicated to the tax policy goal of trying to provide tax relief for the cost of earning income, and that then the educational and childhood development goals, should be pursued through spending programs. It doesn't, you don't have to have that division of labor, but that does strike me as maybe a natural way to go, and that it actually may make sense to have each provision focused as closely as possible on a distinctive goal, instead of having programs that are trying to serve an amorphous combination of these very distinct goals.
Right.
That's my thought.
Well, so one question from our online viewers, which I think is right on point and a good question. Yes. Catherine, you mentioned states need to take responsibility. Sarah, Elaine, do you know of any states or Catherine, that are sort of doing what you're saying?
Sarah can let me say what I think, and then you can. I've been in several states just over the last few months, and what I'm seeing is there are a small number of states that are literally just now starting to recognize that ultimately it may make sense to see birth to 18 human development dollars. And the idea that we have simply equated human development with K-12 schooling, I think there are states that are starting to see that human development and K-12 schooling are not the same thing.
Sarah, do you have any?
Yeah, I would say, we work primarily at the federal level, but one of our best talking points is on the Hill is quite frankly to talk about the leadership at the state and local level on early learning and the number of governors who have prioritized the issue because they've seen what Catherine's pointing out, and but from both a working families perspective, but as a future workforce perspective, and as the needs of what they see in their communities and in their states. And so, it's this groundswell and this demand side that really I think is going to help us at the federal level push some of these issues over, or move them down the field a little bit more. But it really is happening at the state and local level, and I would say at public-private partnerships too, really are being incubated and driven at the community and state level, and being able to articulate those here has been is really exciting actually, and I think you've gotten great joy out of being able to see it on the ground, and I think it's great.
So I think a lot of states have implemented, or many, these pre-K programs, so they're picking up the 3 and 4-year-olds. So they're certainly going down. I don't think anything that's been said, though, is an argument why the state has to do it. In fact, I think in some cases the states are super inefficient. We build 50 bureaucracies to handle something instead of 1. And there's no reason that the federal government couldn't do an expansion of tax credits for very young children. I wrote a paper with Julia Isaacs about this recently, so we can target extra dollars to those families. There was a recent report out by the Bipartisan Policy Center who kind of said the same thing. States are picking up the 5-year-olds on, so why doesn't the feds pick up the, under 6 crowd? There's no, argument why, the feds can't have a strong voice in this.
Right. Any questions from our audience? Yep.
Hi, Cody Christensen. My question isn't about the bottom quintile of families that I think Catherine pointed out wouldn't receive any benefits, but maybe the next income quintile. The families who would get more than $75 back, but are maybe right on the border of being able to decide will they purchase childcare or not, and might get a few $100s back through this credit. Is the amount, or is the way that the amount of the credit is determined, is it enough to pull that parent off the couch and back into the workforce? And I relate it back to the earned income tax credit. If the earned income tax credit was so low and nobody thought it was worth it to leave unemployment and find a job, then no benefits would be, the incentive wouldn't be large enough. Is the PACE Act for the next quintile of families, is it enough to incentivize childcare?
And just to be clear, though, if they have children, they're not on the couch.
So this is just to make sure that the numbers we're talking about the same numbers. That next quintile, the green one there, is that is essentially that's the next quartile. Essentially a quartile there. It's about 25% of the children who live in a family of at an income level, family of 4 up to 49,000, and that family will receive an extra $75 a month from PACE, which is only the extra that PACE was. It's a little bit more in total under the current CDCTC, but these are the numbers. So we know that those numbers do not change their access to high quality care, but I don't know whether those numbers change their inclination to work.
Well, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think obviously as Elaine said earlier, a lot of the studies it's correct that many of the studies on child care costs are looking at the spending programs. A few of the studies do look at the tax credit. Economists tend to think that effects are continuous. So, if you provide an additional benefit of whatever amount it is, there will be some households who respond. The bigger the benefit is, the more it will be. And so, we could, look, I guess, if we had the numbers in front of us, to try to estimate exactly what the size of the response, we think, might be. Obviously, you would get a bigger response if the expansion was bigger. What the PACE Act is doing, just as to where the numbers come from, is that it's increasing the credit rate by 15 percentage points. And so for a household with 2 children here, and assuming they incur $6,000 or more in child care costs, then that is an extra 15% of the $6,000. So they've got a $900 extra annual tax credit from that. and then it's bigger at the bottom simply because the credit becomes refundable.
Right.
So the assumption here, I guess, must be that the family is currently able to take the credit that the law allows
Correct.
against
Which their monthly finances actually suggest that's probably not the case, but yes, that was the assumption.
So about 10% of families in that second quintile get the child care credit today, and if you get a benefit, your average benefit's about $600.
Right. And that's per year.
For the year, yeah.
For the year. So, I mean, you know, it's, I guess to the point about small and meaningful, right? I mean, yeah, $600 a year is not going to induce someone who's not working probably to get into the labor market. But, you know, as we've heard, there can be, you know, a lot of, there's a lot of other factors that come
I mean, I
into
guess
play.
just to supplement what I said earlier, again, from my perspective, you know, from the work promotion and recognizing the cost of earning taxable income perspective, I guess I would say that you would expect an expansion of the child care tax credit to be a relatively cost-effective way to promote work. So obviously, if the expansion of the credit is modest, you may not see a large absolute increase in work, but it's likely to be significant relative to the budgetary cost of the provision.
Can I just make one comment on this? From an economically rational point of view, if you're just simply doing spreadsheets, that would be the case. However, with these household finances, these families are in many cases, they have another consideration, which is the environments they're able to afford to leave their children in. So a family might see, oh, there's this economic benefit for me to go to work. However, I am compromising the well-being of the most valuable person in my life. So when you figure that in, $75, $200 a month versus the well-being of your child, I think that's something that we actually don't understand a lot about. There hasn't been a lot of work done on how those decisions, how families are taking the well-being of their children into account and making these decisions.
Val, do you have a question?
I agree with what Catherine just said, but let me go back to the economic incentives here and to the argument about economic growth. And I realize this is a totally unfair question, but it's just meant to start a discussion. And that is, you know, Elaine said, well, you know, we have very limited resources. And I think what she's thinking is, well, we shouldn't be increasing deficits and by $1.5 trillion and so forth. And so in that sense, we do have constrained resources. On the other hand, we're in a world now where we're about to spend about $1 trillion over 10 years on corporate tax cuts. So this is a question, I think mainly for you, Alan, but maybe for Elaine as well, which is when you think about just the effects on economic growth, forget about all the things that Catherine and Sarah are rightly concerned about. It's interesting to me to think about whether, you know, a corporate tax cut, and I understand there are many aspects of this that, you know, accelerated depreciation or expensing has a different effect than reducing the corporate rate or whatever. But in general, do you think that that will that it's right to spend that much money on a corporate tax cut and not spend any money on what you guys are all talking about? In other words, where's the balance point in getting the maximum effect on growth if we just stuck to that goal alone? I know it's probably impossible to answer, but I'm just trying to be provocative.
Yeah, no, but it's a good question. It maybe is impossible to answer precisely. I think that the case for reducing the corporate tax rate is very strong because the corporate tax is a penalty on locating investment in the United States, and we are seriously out of line in our statutory rate with other countries. It's the highest in the developed world, third highest in the entire world. The case for the corporate tax reduction is I think, very strong. I don't think that there, you know, has to be a choice of doing one or the other. It's true that resources are limited, but I mean, if I look at expanding the child care credit and at cutting the corporate tax, you know, those do have very different distributional implications, but they are both, I think, reasonably effective ways to promote growth. I mean, if I was trying to identify provisions that were less effective in promoting growth, I mean, I think there'd be other things in the House and Senate tax bills that one could question. For example, the special tax rate for pass-through business income. Other features too, could be questioned. So I think that there, frankly, is a very strong case for doing both. I mean, I do regret that the bill has only the corporate tax rate cut in it and does not have an expansion of the child independent care tax credit. I think you never did get an answer to the question you posed earlier about how the bills treat the refundability of the child credit. So I'm going to just give a quick answer to that. The House and Senate bills are essentially similar in that respect, that they maintain as a starting point today's $1,000 child credit, which is partially refundable to households that have wages. That would remain the same. They introduce a increase in the child credit, $600 in the House bill, $650 in the Senate bill, and initially none of that expansion of the credit is refundable. So the incremental credit is non-refundable. Now the one twist on that
in
is
2018, $100.
the twist on that is that over time, in the Senate bill, actually $100, I guess, is refundable, is subject to the current partial law refundability rules in the first year. And in both bills, the portion that is subject to the current law partial refundability rules grows over time through the mechanism of, so in the House bill, for example, it says today the $1,000 child credit is partially refundable. We will index that $1,000 to inflation. And so over time, a growing portion of the $1,600 total credit will become subject to the partial refundability rules that are found in current law. And so a smaller portion over time will be the non-refundable part.
Just to clarify, when you say the partial refundability in current law, is that this, are we talking about the same thing that I call the added child tax credit?
Yeah, the 15.
Right.
Yes.
And you get it concurrent with your EITC. So there's no change in stacking order. So people do, they can use the same money to get a refund for the EITC and their child tax credit. Now I think the House bill also, in 2018, it goes to $1,100 for the refundable piece.
Oh, does it? In 2018?
Yeah, because they index starting in 2018 and round up to the nearest. So.
But other than the
that's
indexing,
true.
there's really not any new money for low income.
For those
No,
who don't
it's
know
pennies.
income tax, that's right. Yeah, so as a starting approximation, the expansion of the child credit is non-refundable.
I'm sorry to be pressing this, but there are an awful lot of anti-poverty advocates out there who have heard that this child tax credit is, or increased child tax credit is going to be refundable at the bottom, and that's why I keep pressing on this, because there's a lot of confusion about that.
It's absolutely not distributing many dollars to very low-income families. And in the Senate bill that came out of the mark that came up today, all of these provisions expire in 2025. So there is no benefit, no personal income tax changes that carry through except for the change in indexing, which is less generous. So your future EITC in 2027 is going to be indexed so that it's less generous under the new law than it would be under current law. So you will actually have a tax increase relative to current law. The House bill has additional issues because they, part of the offset to some of these lost benefits expires in 2023. And in all cases, as you go over time, families with children who are over 17 will face very large tax increases by the end of the bill. So on the order of, $1,500, these middle-income families. So it's not a tax cut for many families.
Belle, you might be, there was a big push by Senator Rubio and Senator Lee to make it refundable, and I think they had hoped that would get into the proposal. But
Refundable up to the extent of payroll taxes.
yes, which is
Not
also
fully.
an
I guess
interesting.
Sherrod Brown and I think one other Democrat have a bill for full refundability
Yeah.
Right.
of the child tax credit. But yeah, the Rubio and Lee would just have refundability against the payroll
Except they
taxes.
were going to reduce the point you could start getting the credit to the first dollar of earnings, which is not that costly, and all those benefits go to
Yeah,
very
that's,
low-income families.
Instead of the 3,000 threshold.
Instead of
That's
the
right.
$3,000.
That's right.
So the $2,000 is in the bill now, but again, it's over in 2025.
Any other questions from the audience? I've kept our panel up here for a while, but I'm sure they would take another question or two. Anybody? Okay, seeing none. I want to just thank everybody again. I think this was a great conversation. And to continue, right? Because I don't think any of this is really fully resolved, and it probably won't be for quite some time. So join me in thanking our panelists again, and thanks everybody for coming.